What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at the available subclasses for Solasta 2 when it enters early access starting on March 12th. Now, this information was brought to us via an update from Tactical Adventures, the developer themselves. However, truth be told, I am actually a little behind the ball on this. They put out this information towards the end of January, and I just haven't had a time to sit down and parse through it, and I thought I would obviously make some content out of that. Now, if you haven't been keeping up, just so that you are aware that when Solasta 2 hits early access, they're going to have Fighter, Wizard, Rogue, Paladin, Sorcerer, and Clerics. Each of those classes is also going to have 2 of their subclasses available. Now, you will be able to multi-class these, however, in early access initially, the level cap is only going to be 4, so you're not going to be able to make a ton of use out of that or even see necessarily all of the mechanics of these subclasses at first. Last but not least, do keep in mind that some of this stuff is going to be a little bit subject to change here, given both the nature of early access and the fact that some of these are, let's say, homebrew subclasses, so to speak, just so you are aware. Otherwise, however, let's go ahead and get into this. So, starting with the Fighter, first up we have the Commander. This is a returning subclass from Solasta 1, which is, probably unsurprisingly, mostly about support. They get 2 skill proficiencies, they also get to add their strength to intimidation and persuasion, but most importantly is their rousing shout ability advantage, and which will give them and their party advantage on their next attack. Later on, this can be upgraded to provide temp HP to all of the affected characters, while also gaining an ability to, instead of attacking, force an ally to benefit from the dodge action. The more interesting one, however, is probably the Ether Warden. Now, this one is interesting. They talk about how their initial idea for this was an Earth Warden type character, however that wasn't quite working out, so they made some changes. Their sort of core ability is known as Mythology of Might, which is intended to make them a Constitution-based half-caster, which will make their spell save and spell attack modifiers both rely on Constitution instead of Intelligence. I do have to wonder how that's going to wind up being balanced in a game like this, because both being able to literally increase your health and stuff through things like, raising Constitution, getting all the saves from that on top of your casting being from that, I guess it comes down to the spell list they decide to go with at the end of the day, which they do mention will be limited for probably obvious reasons. The main goal there seems to be disabling enemies with things like Sleep, Hideous Laughter, or their level 7 feature, Arcane Strength, which will increase their strength and AC while concentrating on a spell, which will apparently also scale with the level of the spell slot used. One of their final abilities at level 10 will allow them to basically just get a free healing spell based on the level of spell slot used to do so. And so this particular subclass kind of seems like a mix between, of course, being a tank, disabling enemies, and also benefiting heavily from doing so. This is one I will personally be keeping an eye on, as it does sound pretty fun, but that does bring us to the Wizard. First up, we see the return of the Court Mage from Solasta, basically a very defensive-oriented caster, which gets a big benefit to using Shield. In particular, their Spell Shield ability, which absorbs a bunch of damage before breaking and just makes them tankier by default. They did mention that they are reworking some of the higher levels of this though, so the level 6 feature becomes Vigilant Protector, allowing them to teleport to someone who is also shielded by their Spell Shield as a bonus action, while also granting them bonus AC next to that character. At level 10, they'll pick up Shield Resonance, allowing them to, whenever they use a Spell Shield, get resistance to a type of damage they select. So again, a very defensive-oriented mage character. The other subclass, however, is the School of Ruin. This subclass is all about hitting very hard with spells while also killing other wizards. So probably their big ability really is at level 3 Ruination Savant, which is going to give them 2 additional spells that deal damage to their spellbook, and then on top of that, their Destructive Magic feature will add an extra point of damage for every damage dice you roll with this spell. However, what makes them good at killing other magic users is mana feedback. So basically, they're going to reflect a portion of the damage they receive when they are hit by a spell once per short rest. And if that wasn't enough to get the job done, they can also pick up Deadly Resonance, which will allow them to repeat a portion of the damage they've already inflicted to a character at the start of their next turn. This seems like just a really straightforward burn version of a caster in place of something like taking an evocation school wizard, which won't be available straight away as an example. So just a very offensive spellcaster seems pretty straightforward, but probably pretty fun to play just for the big damage. Third up, we then have the Rogue, one of the classics, which will benefit pretty heavily from the 2024 rule set updates from what I understand, which aimed to address like how they attack with dual wielding and not having to use their bonus action as an example, which lets them use cunning action. I don't fully know the details there, but I'm curious about it. But their returning subclass is the Shadowcaster, but it has been heavily reworked. If you're unaware, the Shadowcaster in Solasta 1 was not a particularly popular subclass, and as a result of that, they went back to the drawing board, and basically they liked the core idea, but did not love the way they handled it, and so now their sort of primary ability, Shadowcasting, will unlock at level 3, which is going to allow you to sneak attack on spells with attack rolls. It will also no longer be limited by the schools that you have to choose your spells from, which means it should simply affect more spells overall. And then at a higher level, they still gain Shadow Dodge, but it's even stronger now and named Into the Shadows, which gives them a 25-foot teleport as a bonus action multiple times per rest. And they also get some extra cantrips on top of that. So hopefully that's enough to make that a little more interesting, but we'll simply have to see how it plays. Their new subclass is the Scavenger. This is an interesting one because it combines some combat stuff with some non-combat stuff. Their primary ability is Serrated Edge, which adds additional slashing damage when they attack once per turn, potentially on top of their sneak attacks even, making them even more deadly. However, they're also going to get stuff like Haggler, which gives them 10% price modifiers with merchants, so a bit of higher damage mixed with utility for that one. Overall, I'm mostly curious to see how the Shadowcaster pans out for the Rogue, however. Now, bringing it forward to the Paladin, I'm not sure exactly how to feel about this one because my understanding is with the rule updates, they changed Divine Smite into a Paladin-only bonus action. It's still a spell, but you have to use your bonus action as a Paladin in order to do it, which is a pretty large nerf, I would imagine. But on top of that, Lay on Hands is a bonus action, which allows you to use it and also attack in a turn. So simply put, I have to see how the Paladin plays with these changes as I haven't used them personally, so I guess I will simply find out. But its returning subclass from Solasta is the Oath of Judgment from the Lost Valley DLC. This is an offensive paladin that can immobilize targets when it hits them. However, they did add a little bit of extra force damage on top of that ability, and it no longer costs a bonus action, which means it can be used in combination with this new version of Divine Smite. And then later they get their Aura of Righteousness, which will increase weapon attacks damage and no longer stack with spells. Their other new subclass is the Oath of Liberation. Starting at level 3, their Channel Divinity ability allows them to blind an enemy or shroud their allies, and apparently that shroud their allies, known as Slip Away, is going to give them just straight up invisibility in the finished game, but right now it's just going to be the blur spell, which I thought was interesting. And then at level 7, their Aura of Liberation prevents all nearby allies from being restrained or paralyzed, and I imagine in certain fights that might actually be insanely useful, but otherwise doesn't exactly get me super excited. But that does bring us to the Sorcerer. My understanding is the new rules for 5e basically gave them a version of magical rage, but was otherwise more or less the same. Either way, however, for their returning subclass, they get the Mana Painter. Though they do mention they made some changes to this one simply because they were concerned about it being able to multi-class with other stuff. So Mana Absorption, their big main ability, which allows them to use their Charisma modifier for any saving throw against a spell, now comes at level 6 instead of level 3, and at level 3 they get Mana Shield, which gives them temp HP anytime you use a spell slot. Their other ability, Mana Drain, allows them to recover sorcery points and also deal damage to creatures, and they increased the damage that this will deal with the amount of sorcery points recovered from using it, scaling with your level and potentially just allowing you to use more sorcery points. This one sounds fun. Either way, though, the other subclass is the Star Child. Seems like a simple but effective subclass that will see them manifest shooting stars whenever they use any of their meta magic, which will simply add extra force damage to the spell. And at level 6, they can call upon the stars a few times per day, which will just give them an advantage on any d20 roll. control. But then that brings us to our final class for this with the Cleric. So the Cleric is a bit of an exception because it's the only class here starting with 3 subclasses. Not only that, instead of one old and one returning, all 3 of these are directly from Solasta 1. They were already available, though to be fair, that wasn't exactly some crazy thing for a cleric, and they were kind enough to explain their reasoning about this. Basically, one of the main gods of Solasta is a goddess of life and death that apparently this story is going to be involved with. To that end, they wanted to make sure the life and death domains made it in, which are life and oblivion, but the problem with just including those 2 was that neither of those really fulfilled the upfront and personal version of a cleric, and so they went ahead and added the battle domain in on top of that as well. That said, these are relatively straightforward if you've played a cleric in 5e before with only some minor alterations. So life domain is all about healing, if you would believe it. When you heal, you now heal more. If you use your channel divinity, you can heal your allies as well, and you can even heal yourself while healing others with blessed healers, just, the usual stuff. Now the catch here is that you don't get just like default access to heavy armor with this domain anymore, which means you're a little squishier as a result. But then there's the Oblivion domain. This is actually a trick domain that transports you to Cyrodiil in the Elder Scrolls to fight off hordes of Daedra. But once you're done with that and you transport yourself back to Solasta 2 to play the game, the Oblivion domain gets the ability Gatekeeper, which allows them to heal unconscious allies up to 1 HP from range as a bonus action a few times per day, and they can give advantage to death saving throws just like before. Their channel divinity ability, Herald of Pain, allowing them to deal damage to enemies around them, will actually scale up now, making it more useful after the first few levels. That kind of thing. Basically, if you want to play a deathly cleric, that's the way to go. A little more of a caster focus, if you couldn't tell by all the ranged abilities there, though. Then finally we have the battle domain. Pretty straightforward, but some minor changes in there nonetheless. They still get the ability to take on a bunch of temporary HP once a day. They also have the ability to cast spells even with, like weapons and shields in hand, that kind of thing. With some relatively minor nerfs otherwise though, as their Herald of Battle is no longer an aura and instead empowers allies whenever you hit with Decisive Strike, and while empowered, attack rolls are automatically re-rolled on a miss, allowing you that extra chance. Though they will also take some scaling force damage alongside that. And that's kind of the idea for Solasta 2's initial bit of subclasses. Do keep in mind that this is just the stuff they have planned for early access, and there will be more. But speaking for myself, one of the main things I am personally excited for is when we finally get the opportunity to mess around with multi-classing, especially with some of their more homebrew subclasses that are new to Solasta 2. Though I don't know how long that will take exactly, because with the initial level limitation in early access, it might be a little bit before we get to fully dive into some of the nuances of how some of that is going to work. But either way, with how Solasta is shaping up and the fact that they can make unique subclasses for their game here, which promises to be a bit of a mix-up to the usual formula, is good enough for me for the time being. And that is where we're going to leave this video, not too much longer before we'll be playing this for ourselves via early access on March 12th. But in the meantime, that's going to do it. If you're looking forward to playing any particular one of these, I would love to hear about it. Truth be told, of all of them, I think the Ether Warden is probably the one I'm personally the most excited to try, but we'll see how it goes. Either way though, certainly like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.